Fine Woodworking's holiday sale officially starts tomorrow, November 9th. Head over to thetauntonstore.com to save up to 80% on new and classic titles, including the 2017 Fine Woodworking Archive and the complete illustrated guide to woodworking, available in USB format for the first time. Plus, save 20% on your order with the code GIFT20, GIFT20. Now for a web producer's note. On this episode, we had an interview with Tim Coleman, and unfortunately, we did not have the greatest Skype connection. It's a little difficult to listen to, but if you can work your way through it, the information is phenomenal, and you're going to learn a lot. Now, on to the show.
Welcome to Shop Talk Live, Fine Woodworking's bi-weekly podcast. I'm your host, Tom McKenna, and with me this week are Mike Pekovich.
Hey, guys.
And Matt Kenny.
Hello, everyone.
Behind the camera, as always, are Ben Strano.
Hello.
Hey, Ben. And Jeff Rose.
Hey. Howdy, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff. Haven't seen you in a while. We have
He's always here. I don't know why you haven't seen him.
I missed the last one. I was in Nashville at a honky tonk. We have a packed show today, so we're going to jump right to the questions. And the first one comes from Andrew. And Andrew says, I'm looking to build a large outfeed table for my table saw with plenty of storage for jigs, air compressor tools, etc. I would like to have this outfeed table be mobile, but I need to find a solution to help level the outfeed table to the table saw. Any suggestions? I'm sure we have lots.
Yeah. Who's going to go first?
Well, okay, so it's mobile. That means you got it on wheels.
Yeah.
Couple things. Number one, it doesn't have to be dead flat to your table saw. So if anything, kick it down like 1/8 of an inch or even 1/4 of an inch. It's going to support the stock as it comes out without a problem, and you don't have to worry about it. You do probably want it fairly coplanar, meaning you don't want it low at the table, but then have it sort of raise up and lift the stock as it exits. I would do this. I would get it in position. Hopefully your table saw isn't mobile too. That's okay if it is. So let's say your table saw is mobile. Put it in one place, put some tape on the ground so you can roll it right to that spot. Get your outfeed table where it needs to go, and then somehow get it shimmed up or leveled to where when it's in that specific space, it's where you want it. And then just make sure you roll it back into that spot every time, and you're good to go. Mm-hmm. Or don't make your outfeed table mobile at all, and don't make your table saw mobile. I know that's hard. I mean, for most people, for a lot of people, that isn't an option, but it is the best solution. Get it in there, get it locked in place, get it leveled up to where you want it, and just don't move it.
Yeah. Coplanar is more important than level. All of my shops since I moved to Connecticut have been in garages that serve double duty as ski jump takeoffs. And I never tried to level anything because it was just too difficult. So I think what I would do if I were going to make it mobile is I would make it the same way that I made my router table, which is it's on a mobile base, and the bottom of it is like, there's a cabinet, and it has your drawers or your doors or whatever you're doing there.
Right.
And then on top of the cabinet, I would build a wooden frame, and then on top of that frame, I would put threaded doodahs in the four corners.
Oh, okay.
And that would attach to the top. And then you could just level the top and still keep it mobile.
Oh, that's a good solution.
But the leveling the top is independent of it being mobile. So, oddly, that's one of I think when it comes to woodworking problems, there's people try to solve them with and keep everything together. And really what this question is, there's two questions here. It's really two things. I want to have a mobile base. I want to have something that's level with the top. But the solution doesn't have to be involve both the mobility and the leveling, right? Mm-hmm. If you separate those two things out and make them two separate independent things, it becomes a lot easier to solve the problem.
Oh.
Yeah.
See, I think a lot of people, when they approach woodworking problems, they don't realize that, I can separate out these different functions or purposes, and then that makes everything a lot easier. It's like when I do cut boxes, miters for boxes, and you want everything to be square. That's why I cut things to length first, and then miter them, because that's two separate operations. And it makes it easier to do if you separate them out.
Nice. I like that.
So
Separate. We need a source for doodads.
what are those things called?
It was doodads.
Doodads, something like that. Some kind of leveler in between the frame and the top.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a this kind of weird table that I built as an outfeed table, and I had a roller on it, and because my table saw is also on a mobile base because of my space, I did away with that outfeed table because it just once I moved the table sides, moved the outfeed table, but I still need something like this. I need some sort of outfeed support. Right now, I'm just using a roller outfeed roller, which is working fine because I don't do as much ripping on my table saw as I used to, so I don't have those long pieces coming off the back end as I used to. I do most of my ripping now, excuse me, on the bandsaw. But the one thing I would say for him is if he has a sled on his table, so you have to account for those
The little tracks.
the T-tracks coming off. So keeping it low is a sound idea to keep that clearance so you can push the sled all the way through without hitting the top of the outfeed table.
I've seen outfeed tables that are that low, and to me, that's too low. I just bite the bullet and just route the slots in there. Every time I move my outfeed table, I have to plug them and reroute them.
It doesn't have to be a perfectly sized slot.
Yeah.
Anyway, so you can
Make it oversized.
Make it a little bit oversized and get in there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good idea because really, like my quote-unquote outfeed table, it functions as an outfeed table maybe 2% of the time. The rest, it's a second bench, it's an assembly table, it's a finishing table. It's just holding a bunch of junk that I have to move out of the way. On the rare occasions, I actually rip something long enough to get onto the outfeed table. So, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, I can dream about a fixed table saw and outfeed table, but I have a lolly column kind of right in the middle of my room, and it's really hard to work around those things in the space that I have, which is very rectangular, but all good stuff.
Yeah, that's cool.
So let's get to our next question. This one comes from Terry. Put my peepers on. And Terry says, I'm having a real problem with bandsaw drift. I own a 12-inch bandsaw. I've tried everything to get this saw to cut straight. Right when I get it just right and use a practice piece, it cuts great. Then when I try cutting the project, it drifts off the cut and then straightens out and cuts at the wrong dimension. I use 1/4-inch 4 TPI skip and a 1/2-inch 4 TPI resaw blade, and it happens on every blade. And the blades are new, not dull. The guides are horrible, hard to set, but I think I have them set correctly. Can you help?
Well, so one, the 1/2-inch blade, right? You'd agree is probably too much for this for 12-inch wheels.
For 12-inch
that's
bandsaw,
huge.
the frame is just not heavy enough to
It's not made for that.
tension it properly. I think.
Right. So you might, for resawing and straight sawing, go down to something like a 3/8.
Yeah.
A 3/8 inch blade. I would, I can think of two solutions off the top of my head. One, or two explanations. One of the explanations is that, and this is going to sound kind of jerky, but contrary to your beliefs, you are not setting the bandsaw up properly. That there's something wrong. There's something wrong in your setup process. It says that the guides are crummy, so it could just simply be that the guides are not set up properly and maybe can't be set up properly.
Or they lose their setting.
Or they lose their setting. I had some guides once that I would get them set up, and then when you lock them in place, the screw and the pressure applied to it would cant them cattywampus, and it was a pain in the neck to get those set up right.
You need a doodah.
You need a doodah to fix the cattywampus.
So they're not cattywampus or wonky. So I think that's a distinct possibility that it's actually not set up correctly.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. The other thing could just be
it's a bad saw.
It's a bad saw. You need a new saw. It's sometimes saws are you get a tool and it's a tool bomb.
Yeah, I mean, could be even that the wheels are not coplanar, top and bottom.
Well, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt to where he was able to wrangle this thing into a certain setup to where you can take a test piece and cut a straight cut. But it kind of leads to your second gambit there, that maybe, it's not you, it's the saw, in that, say your test piece is just a 3/4 inch thick piece of scrap wood and it's cut nice and straight. Now you're going to resaw something that's maybe 3 inches thick.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you're putting a lot more pressure on the blade. And if you have sort of an undersized guidepost on the saw that wants to flex back, or maybe the bearings aren't fully in contact with the back of the blade, anytime the blade is not supported in the back and it instead of flexing straight back, it's called barreling.
Yeah.
It will sort of, as it goes back, it will go to one side or the other. So that sounds like what's happening, where your setup piece is great. Your next piece, it starts to wander and then sort of refine straight, which means, as it flexes out, it's going to be sort of a changing curve. But then once it reaches like full flex, now all of a sudden it's cutting at a different angle.
Yeah. I mean, related to that, here's another distinct possibility, which I forgot about, but we had discussed before, is I have seen bandsaws that if he's setting them, he might have, let's say he's setting it in with a 3/4 inch thick piece of stock, and he sets it and it works fine, but then he's going to resaw something that's 2 or 3 or 4 inches, right? And he has to raise the guidepost. If the guidepost does not go perfectly straight up and down, when you raise it up, let's say, it's going to, it could put twist into the blade, a little bit of twist. It could do all kinds of things to the blade that would lead it to deflect or barrel during the cut. But also I've noticed, like on my own bandsaw, and this is usually an indication of a dull blade, but if you start the cut and it pops out or in a little bit, and then after you are cutting, it moves back, that I've seen that happen as well, and it kind of jumps out a little and then starts to cut, and but that I usually associate that with a dull blade. So the other thing with the blade is get the fence out of the way, draw a straight line on a board, and just try to freehand that straight line. If the blade tends to kind of wobble right and left, and you do this continuous steer right and left to try to track the line, that's the sign of a dull blade as well. A blade, it should be able to track a line really easily, really accurately. Definitely, yeah.
And maybe a 12-inch bandsaw, maybe if you're trying to resaw, you're just asking it to do something it's not really designed to do. Probably, I bet it handles curves and flat stock really well. Maybe keep a 1/4 inch blade on there. And if you upgrade to a bigger saw later, I don't know if you got room for it, keep this thing around with a skinny old blade on there and put maybe a 1/2 inch blade on the bigger guy.
Dedicated
for
to
everything
resaw.
except for your really scrolly cuts, and have this thing around.
Yeah. Get a 20-inch bandsaw
with a 20-inch blade.
With a 1-inch blade, carbide tip blade on it, you'll be set.
Golden.
Just make sure it has good guides.
Well, Michael Fortune has done some great articles on bandsaw setup that maybe Terry can check out. Maybe Ben can post some of them. I think he did one on resawing, but he just did a bunch of other basic setup on
He did one, was it like 5 tips for bandsaw setup or something?
Yeah, something like that. So another good resource to kind of troubleshoot what you're doing. Okay, let's move on to a special guest. This episode, we're going to talk to Tim Coleman, eminent furniture maker and designer up in Shelburne, Massachusetts, and a member of the New Hampshire Furniture Masters is with us on Skype. Hi, Tim.
Good morning, all.
Hey, Tim.
We have, I don't know if you've ever met Matt Kenny or Mike Pekovich in person, but they're sitting with me.
No, I have not.
No, this is like the stalker syndrome, because I've known of your work and I've worked on your articles for many, many years. So it's sort of like I probably know way more about you than I probably should, having never met you. But it's fine to finally talk to you in person.
Well, through Instagram now, we all know a lot about daily workings of our lives.
That's true.
Yeah.
So, but it's nice to be this close to both of you, Matt and Mike and Tom. You and I have numerous.
That's right. I don't see any of your.
I feel like I can reach them.
The only thing I'm missing is seeing your Bob Dylan posters in the background.
Oh, you want me to turn
No, I was just joking. One of the things, as I mentioned, well, I didn't mention it, but Tim is a graduate of the College of the Redwoods, has been making furniture since the 1980s. And we have a couple of questions and some things we wanted to talk to you about. But I wanted to begin with a quick question kind of relating to your design aesthetic. And just wondering, you're a Redwoods grad, I think it's called the Krenov School now. How is your design aesthetic similar to the Krenov philosophy that you learned, and how is it different? I know you've taken some great strides kind of away from it, but there's always a taste of Krenov in your furniture. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I would begin by saying that there's the aesthetic and there's also the design approach. And as I've often talked to people about Jim's way of designing, he would refer to it as composing. And what that means is that he was creating as he was building, and as opposed to beginning with a design that was fairly well developed prior to embarking on the project. And that's something that I really took to heart. And it's not always easy, because you have to be open to things changing along the way, and you have to build in such a way where there's flexibility as much as possible. You try not to get yourself boxed into a corner where you don't have a lot of options, and
right.
There's only one way to achieve something. And that means a lot of mock-ups, trying to work with things full scale, cutting parts oversized so that you have options of the dimensions. And as far as the aesthetic, Jim, certainly his background in the Scandinavian tradition, having gone to the Malmsten School in Sweden, I certainly look to that aesthetic in my own work. And then also the broad Asian aesthetic, Japanese, Chinese, Korean furniture, in terms of the use of materials and the value put on the material, and some of the subtleties in shaping and joinery, how the joinery becomes often part of the aesthetic. So I would say that there are those two things, the composing aspect and then those two traditions, the Scandinavian and the Asian. I think Jim and I have some common ground there that we cover.
When I've worked with Tim a few times over the years, and he's always been very gracious about letting me peek under like the moving blanket that's in the corner. And one time I was there, it's when I discovered that you were working on the Eisenhower project. And it's basically where Tim is recreating original furniture for the Eisenhower house in Gettysburg. And you also did some reproductions for one of the Frank Lloyd Wright houses, right? In upstate New York, was it?
That's correct, in Buffalo, the Martin House.
So how do you like that work as well? How different is that experience been for you versus following your own creativity and your own kind of journey through a piece of furniture? What's that experience been like?
Those experiences are fascinating because it immerses me in another world, which is furniture conservation. Primarily. So I'm working with conservators in these historic homes, and this is actually a new direction in historic homes, where in the past, if there were furnishings that were missing from the home, they would not make an effort to replace them in any way. They might have some interpretive display, a photograph, or something of what the piece may have looked like in the room. But the shift now is to actually recreate those pieces so that the museum goers have a more complete experience when they tour the house.
Yeah.
So working in that way, it's more like being part of a museum setting. Whereas what I took away from working on these historic pieces, it really takes me away from my own aesthetic, and allows me to really become fully immersed in another style.
Yeah.
Frank Lloyd Wright, his furnishings were so important to the overall architectural scheme. You know, they sometimes the rooms could not really stand without the furnishings there. So they really were a part of the design concept, even though they often were not comfortable for the occupant. From a design standpoint, they were really essential to his vision.
Yeah. Tim, we've always we've been trying to get your furniture in the magazine for a long time. And we finally have one of your pieces, and it came about, I think I saw it on Instagram or something during your design process. And so in our January-February issue this year, Tim has finally got us a project, and it's this beautiful round table with a really innovative joint for the lower stretcher assembly. And we're excited to see that. Can you describe the process of developing that joint? I saw it. You kind of gave us glimpses on Instagram and on Facebook, but maybe not everyone has seen your feed. But can you talk about your development of that unique joint with the disc and the kind of the pinned, bridle joints?
In a number of projects I've done, I've had stretchers that connect the lower parts of the legs close to the floor. And one thing that does is it makes those components quite visible. And so initially, with this table, I was thinking of crossing those stretchers and using a simple bridle joint, so that the very simplest way of connecting them, really. It's clean. There's not a lot of detail about it. But as I was drawing it full scale and then actually modeling the piece, I created an 1/8-inch scale model, and through that, creating that model, which was rather crude, it was just sticks of wood, roughly shaped, and hot together. I started I could actually do this out of 4 pieces, and I could join them at the center, and by beveling them, or creating a 45-degree cuts on the ends of each one, I could nest them together, and so I started playing around with that idea, and the joinery for that started how to get tenons in there. You have to do sort of a cross tenon, maybe out of plywood, and that started to seem more complicated than it was worth.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, I just started to think about how I might cut a notch in the end of those pieces and have that notch sort of slip onto one piece, one large tenon. And then as I started thinking about it that way, the idea of exposing part of that so that it appeared as a disc made a lot of sense with a round tabletop as well. It was a nice tie-in to design it that way.
It's like the perfect storm, attractive and functional.
Yeah. So. And then the pinning aspect of it, it made sense to pin the joint like that. It gives it a lot more strength. But then I also realized that by pinning it on a draw bore technique, which would actually pull the joint together, it meant that I didn't have to do a complicated clamping method to clamp those parts. A clamp that would run the length of the parts, so the draw bore pulls it together without having to cross clamp.
Cool.
Great. Well, we have Tim does a lot of resawing of veneer, and in his work. So we have a reader question for you, Tim, that seems right up your alley, and it comes from a guy named Steve. And so he says, please discuss veneer from the perspective of making your own, both for show faces and shop-made plywood. What range of thickness is considered veneer versus lamination? I want to be able to hand plane the surface lightly. At what thickness does seasonal wood movement become an issue? It's a loaded question.
Well, it's a really good question, because I think a lot of people wonder about that. When is veneer no longer veneer? And at the College of the Redwoods, we worked a lot there with Bandsaw veneer. There was never any commercial veneer that entered the building there, so it was all Bandsaw veneer. And the rule of thumb there was 3/32 thick. If you went over that, then it was no longer veneer. And I think that's generally a good rule of thumb. However, I've gone a little bit thinner with mine over time, because I have, on occasion with certain wood species, with edge joints in 3/32 veneer, had those joints open up a little bit. So I began to experiment by going a little bit thinner with mine. So I'm generally closer to a 1/16 of an inch thick on most of my veneer. I cut it off at the bandsaw. It's usually closer to 3/32 when it comes off the saw, and then by the time I actually process it through my sander, and the full finish thickness is closer to a 1/16 of an inch. Yeah. And I find with at a 1/16 of an inch, you can still hand plane that to finish off the surface. You have to be careful. You got to make sure your hand plane is nice and sharp, so you're not creating tear out that then you have to go deeper to clean up. But I think I feel most comfortable closer to a 1/16 of an inch thick. It still gives you plenty of material there to work the surface with hand tools. And for a lot of my designs, I will kind of piece together surfaces with veneer tiles, where I'll bevel the edges slightly of the veneer pieces and piece them together. And at a 1/16 of an inch thick, you can actually you can get a pretty decent bevel on the edges of those. Whereas with commercial veneer, you really couldn't do that at all. So I would go with a 1/16 or a strong 1/16 is what I would say is a comfortable thickness.
Right. What about your approach to making your own plywood?
Well, that's you get into a little bit different territory there. You can go thicker with plies. So, for instance, if you look at commercial veneer core plywood, some of those plies are as thick as 1/8 of an inch. In some cases, even more than that. There's some plywoods where the plies are quite thick, as much as 1/4 of an inch, and then you can get into actual lumber core plywood where the core can be whatever thickness you want. I've created some of my own lumber core where essentially a lumber core is you have your face veneer, and then the actual lumber core runs in the same direction as the face veneer. Yep. The lumber core is cross laminated with veneer that runs perpendicular to solid wood sticks and perpendicular to the face veneer. And lumber core veneer has been around for centuries. Really, that's what that was pre-plywood. Lumber core was the material that veneer was applied to. But in my so the one thing to know about any plywood that you're making up is the plies that are on the outside faces still need to be thin. So those are typically around a 1/16 of an inch thick, because if you get any movement of that that vinyl ply on the surfaces, that might telegraph through to the face veneer. So whatever you're doing to create your plies in homemade plywood, well, two things. One is you have to have an odd number. You're crossing the veneers, so that, but then the last two face veneers on the upper and lower sides, they run contrary to the direction of your face veneer.
Right.
And those are around a 1/16 of an inch thick.
Great.
So I hope that answers the question.
I think you did, and then some.
Sounds like a good article is on the way.
Tim will be at Fine Woodworking Live in April in Southbridge, Mass., and we're looking forward to seeing you in person. Thanks for taking a few minutes to spend some time with us.
Oh, it was my pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to Fine Woodworking Live. I heard a lot about the events in the past, and it sounds like a great weekend. And I know Sturbridge, the area, it's a lovely place and be for a weekend. So look forward to seeing all of you there, and Mike and Matt, maybe we'll even be able to shake hands.
That'd be awesome.
All right, Tim. Thanks again.
All right.
Thanks.
Okay.
Take care.
Good day.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Well, that was a great chat with Tim. I'm happy that we're finally getting him in the magazine with a project. He's done a lot of great technique articles for us, but that table is outstanding. So be sure to check it out in the Jan-Feb issue. Let's get to our next segment. It's time for our all-time favorite technique of all time for this week.
All right, the favorite technique. Who's starting?
I think Mike wants to go first.
Yeah, I'll start.
Is Mike going first?
Yeah, since my little script says all-time favorite tool of all time for the week.
Sorry.
My technique for the week is a tool, actually. Actually, it's a pair of tools, so I guess that would make a technique, right? 2 tools equals a technique.
I'm pretty sure that's not accurate.
That's fuzzy math. Isn't that funny math?
Yeah, fuzzy math.
So for my errant all-time favorite tool of all time for the week is a box joint blade set, which I use all the time. If you're not familiar with it, it's a pair of blades that stack together similar to a dado set. The difference is the blades have teeth that are completely flat across the top. The teeth are also offset from the plate in one direction, so you can stack them in one direction to get a 1/4 inch cut on my set, and you can stack them, flip the stack, and you get a 3/8 inch cut. So it's really versatile. I also like to use the blades individually because it gives me, I think it's just like a skinny 3/16 of an inch.
It's
curve,
heavy 3/16.
Or heavy 3/16,
Yeah.
which I really like. It's a really nice dimension. I use it for drawer bottoms on smaller parts where I don't want the full 1/4 inch drawer bottom groove, but I also don't want just an 1/8 inch or have to take multiple passes. I'll also use a single blade if I'm doing like a little lattice work, half lap lattice work. All my kumiko I do with an 1/8 inch blade, but if I'm doing a larger scale lattice work like I did for a glass door front, that 3/16-ish dimension looked a lot better. So that blade is really cool, and the good thing about it, the main difference between that and a dado blade is the dado blade has those little kind of ears on either side to score the grain for cross-grain cut, so it leaves not a truly flat bottom. This blade does a really, really good job of that. In fact, I've also used it with the workpiece held vertically in conjunction with the tenoning jig, so I can cut the cheek of the tenon as well as the shoulder of the tenon with the top of the blade, and it leaves a really, really clean cut. Where I've been using it just recently is I'm making a little case with a sliding door, and so I cut grooves in the top and bottom of the case for the sliding door, and that blade works perfectly for that.
See, the perfect technique would have been
Here's my technique.
the tenoning thing. That's a good technique.
I think I gave you like 3 techniques.
Oh, yeah.
So, and also, so when I'm cutting the grooves, whenever you're cutting grooves in stock, it's really important to keep the stock against the table so you have a consistent depth of groove. And one thing I've been moving towards, and I use it every time I can, is it's like a soft rubber grout float as a push pad. They're fantastic. The one I have has a fancy wooden handle that was made for me by Jerry Forshee from Mark Adams, who was helping me out there one year and makes these. But, I mean, these things grip amazingly. I use them for any sheet goods, any rips, wider than 5 or 6 inches where I can get my pad on there, and especially something like this for non-through cuts to really keep the workpiece on the table. Yeah. I also use them at my jointer. They're fantastic for that.
Yeah, I used to have one of those, and I used it for my jointer, but my cat puked on it, and I didn't want to reuse it again.
Well, the thing is...
But the grip is incredible.
Yeah.
It's really much better than the store-bought rubberized push pads.
Oh, those are horrible, and they're expensive.
Yeah.
These are grout floats. The ones that Bob uses at Connecticut Valley, they're red. It's a soft rubber. Don't get the hard black with the really smooth bottom. There's a red rubber grout floats where it looks kind of more spongy. Those things grip amazingly. They're really cheap, and you can get them at a home center as opposed to having to order them from a woodworking catalog or something.
Yeah,
there's one stuck to your back right now.
That's why he's floating.
All right.
That's why he's so smooth.
What?
Come on, work with me here.
So, Matt, you want to go next?
Matt goes next.
Somebody.
I need to calm down over here.
All right. So my technique this week is not a tool; it's a technique, and it's something that I learned. I have to admit, I'm embarrassed a bit to admit how I learned this, because you would think that having grown up with a father who's a contractor, and having been in making furniture for many, many years before I sort of discovered on my own by looking at doors in the house, just like noticing the doors in the house, that the way to get a really nice reveal on the pull side of the door is to bevel that style so that it's a little bit narrower at the back than it is at the front. And you do that because what that does is it allows the back corner of that style to clear the case.
Yeah.
But if you were just to make that all straight and just and plane it down straight until it cleared, there would be a really big gap on that side. So if you bevel it, it allows that back corner to clear, and then when it's closed, the gap between the style and the cabinet is nice and tight. So I learned that through observation, but I should have known it long before because it's a technique that's been around forever. But I just never knew it. And in the past, I'd always done this sort of freehand, which with larger stuff you sort of have to. But I'm currently making a small jewelry cabinet that has part of it is a cabinet with a door, and I wanted to bevel it. And I thought a good way to do that and control it would be to take an old piece of Kumiko, which was a 1/16 of an inch thick. I put it on underneath the door on my shooting board, and then just shot that style until that angle was on the style, and it was perfect. So that's my technique I guess my technique is not just to bevel that style, but if you can, put it on some type of shooting board and prop it up a little bit so that you get a nice, straight, clean bevel.
So your technique is really a stick.
It is a stick.
No, his tool is a stick.
My tool is a stick.
I've done that as well. Usually, like you said, on bigger stuff, I do it by hand with a block plane. And I just do sort of a shallow bevel on that back corner. It never extends the full width of that door side, but that's really cool, especially for your stuff, which is like really clean and crisp. Having a weird half shallow bevel would be strange, but having a really accurate full sort of slanted edge is very, very cool.
Yeah, it's really I was going to take a photograph with like a square or something on it to show you how much it's out of square, but it's so minuscule that you can barely see it. So I didn't do that.
That's cool. Yeah. So that won't work on bigger stuff. It's too bad you couldn't do something like tilt the table saw blade just a little and rip that edge.
You could, but a table saw is not really I don't know.
It's not a finishing tool.
I wouldn't do it on a small piece like that.
No, I mean, I'd be nervous fitting a door on a table saw.
Oh, I do that all the time.
Do you?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, not me.
Okay.
All right. That's my technique, Tom.
I should have done that for my solid wood door. It binds a little bit in the summer.
Well, you can still go back and do it.
I can just take it off the hinge and give it a couple of swipes.
Just get a circus saw and do it with a small cabinet.
Just whack it with a brick.
Get my track saw.
Just do it with a chainsaw, evidently. That's okay.
Get my belts in.
That's the sign of a really good technique is when the other two people just get kind of quiet and go,
Oh yeah.
oh,
Rats.
yeah.
That door wouldn't hit if I did that.
What you got, Tom?
I kind of have my I have to say my technique, I'm sort of embarrassed by it because it's not yet fully developed. But part of my process was I'm reading the layouts for the issue that's going out the door, and our workshop tip winner was a gentleman, I don't recall his name. He's presenting a way to cut dovetails on the bandsaw, both the tails and the pins.
Yeah.
And his method involved some really clever
Dan
jigs.
Sweeney.
Dan Sweeney. Thanks, Ben. But I don't like making jigs. So I was trying to figure out, I was inspired. I have some projects coming up that I'm going to have to cut a lot of dovetails for. And so I thought, he's got some really cool angle jigs, but, I've got a bevel gauge. I can easily do what he's doing using my bevel gauge to cut the tails. Oh. So I set it up this way. And the first thing I discovered that when I do this again, it got running late last night when I was trying to fix everything, but I realized I now have an excuse finally to get rid of that ruler on the front of my bandsaw table, which I never use anyway, because I couldn't get my bevel gauge to align perfectly. It was a little bit awkward cutting the tails, but basically the gauge, I set it to the angle of my dovetail and lined it on the edge of the table saw, the bandsaw rather, and cut the tails that way, from both sides.
So you're using the blade of the bevel gauge as a fence to run the stock against.
Exactly,
That's really cool.
Exactly. So, I have a very large bevel gauge, as you can see, but the other thing that Dan did that was really clever was he made an angled platform to cut the tails. And what you could do is switch the platform to both sides of the blades to cut the different angles. Mm-hmm. Before I dove into this, I was thinking, my bandsaw table tilts. Why can't I do that? And then I realized pretty quickly that, I've got to be able to tilt it both ways. So my first experiment failed.
But a lot of bandsaws will tilt at least 10 degrees.
Not mine. Not the other way.
Not the other way.
Mine does 5, I think.
I couldn't go that far. So what I realized, am I stuck? And I sat there and I stared and I stared and I realized, all I need to do is get the angle. So what I decided to do at first was to make basically like a shim to just get that workpiece at the right angle. And I happened to have some 1/4-inch Luan plywood around, and I cut a strip off of that. And the angle actually worked out perfectly for the angle of the pins that I was making. And so I was able to clamp that down. And, for both sides, I did clamping on one side of the blade for the first angled cuts for the pins, switched it to the other side and did the other angles. And then I did some rough clearing out with the bandsaw blade to get down to the baseline, and I pulled it off the saw. And my first try went together fairly well. I have it here. And I did make one cut on the wrong side of the line on the pins, but I did no pairing on this at all, as you can see, because of the gaps. But but it went together really well. So now I know that at least my theory works, and now I just need to better refine my technique to make it clean and surefire. So I'm excited about it.
You should make some jigs to do those 2 steps.
Well, I'm sort of making jigs. I have to store jigs. That's my big issue. But if I had these strips that could work, I think.
For tails, I often cut my tails at the bandsaw when I have a lot to do, and I taking something from an article by Stephen Hammer, which I did the photography for. It's just I just have a piece of 1/8-inch MDF that has that wedge that matches the slope of the tail, and down at the end there's a little stop, and you just use that, and you just flip. It actually makes it really easy to do symmetrical tails. But anyways,
it still requires the handwork, at the base to flush it up. But the fact that I get it fit right there, and all I have to do is kind of clean out the corners, gives me kind of a leg up on what I have to build.
Very cool.
I'm excited.
Or you could do that at the table saw.
I could. Well, one of the pieces I have to make is, well, that I want to make is a tall cupboard, like probably the Enfield style cupboard, and I want to dovetail the top, and I can't really do that on the table saw.
I was just kidding.
Although it would be fun to photograph.
I was joking. I did a tall case piece on the table saw once. My Enfield cupboard. I did
You
those.
did that on the
I did those on the table saw.
I thought you routed those.
I routed out the pins in between the pins.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I cut the tails on the table saw. I think.
I don't recall.
I'm pretty sure. It wasn't in the article.
All right. Well, let's get to our final question. This one comes from Ron. And Ron says, I'm making the Steve Latta Spice Box from issue 196, and I'm concerned about the crown and the base molding. As the case expands and contracts with seasonal movement, won't gaps eventually show between the molding and case, or could the molding crack? Parts of the molding glue up will be cross-grain. I'm at the point where it's time to attach the molding, but I'm afraid I'm missing something. Any advice you can offer would be great. And Ben had talked to Steve yesterday about this issue. Do you want to chime in and relay the answer?
Well, I don't know. Steve used the term "pick your poison" frequently in the conversation, but I think what it comes down to is he has always glued it on, and in 25 years he's never had an issue. And that's probably got a lot to do with the depth of the case only being 9 inches. So there's not that much room for it to become an issue. If it was a 20-inch deep case, he would treat it differently. He would glue the front and nail the back and use biscuits to keep everything aligned laterally. But in his words, you know, I glue it on. If 25 years later it falls off, I glue it on again. If 25 years after that it falls off, I'm dead. It's not my problem.
Excellent.
And in pre-production we had talked about like Bexford uses the dovetail method, and he said on a short case like that, on a case that isn't that deep, he's found that it's difficult to get those tight.
Did you mention the type of glue he uses on that?
That I should have asked about. I would assume hide.
He uses hide glue a lot,
Yeah.
I think, or primarily, right?
Yeah, but
Hide glue is very
I dropped
rigid
the ball on
glue
that
line, though.
No, yeah. I was going to say if he
I
used
wonder.
like a yellow glue or something with a little squishier glue line.
He uses silly putty, which has a very flexible glue line.
I use yak saliva.
Oh my god, that escalated quickly.
Or de-escalated.
Yeah, you went right over fish glue to yak saliva. So.
Live from Nepal.
I'll shoot him an email and put it in the show notes.
Cool. All right. Well, let's wrap this bad boy up. I think we want to do some recommendations. Who wants to hit that first? Matt?
No.
Mike?
I did not know we were going to do recommendations.
It's a thing.
Now we're doing it every time now. Okay. All right.
We're supposed to.
All right. I'll have one by the time it gets around
Well,
to me.
take a minute right now and think of one so I can think of one.
I got one. I can go
All right,
first.
you
if
go
you-
first.
Hey, if you get a chance, check out the Vietnam series by Ken Burns on PBS. It's a great series. I think it's 12 or 13 episodes, if I'm not mistaken. But it's great because what I love about it is that you get both sides of the story. He talks to a lot of Vietnamese soldiers and citizens, as well as the American soldiers and citizens. So you get really a good insight to both sides.
Cool. I have one.
Awesome.
I just thought of this. I've been putting my yellow glue not in like the big container. I don't know if you've noticed this. I use the type of glue where it's got the cap that kind of pulls up a little bit to squeeze out the glue, and then you push it back down to lock it. And it seems like over the last couple of years, I don't know if the plastic formulation of the cap has changed or the glue formulation has changed, but they're really hard to open. They get really, really stuck.
Just had
Maybe
that.
you've just gotten weak.
No. So what I've been doing is I've been buying like the smaller, clear, round, sort of squishy plastic bottles with the pointy top and the red cap on top. I just get a couple of those things. I've been using those. Actually, I got them to put shellac in for, squirting on a shellac pad. And I said, I'm sticking glue in one. And it worked like really, really well. And so I had just a really small opening in it to squeeze out a thin glue line, but then I was doing a glue up, it was too slow, so I cut it for a bigger opening so I could really squish the glue out. But then when I went back to a space where I needed a thin glue line, that didn't work. So now I have 2 glue bottles, one with a thin opening, one with a wider opening. And the red caps come off much easier, but try not to lose those.
I'm surprised you didn't colorize the caps to differentiate which bottle you were grabbing.
Oh, yes.
There's another tip.
Yeah, there you go.
So I recommend, I thought of a couple of different things. Mine's glue related too.
Cool.
I recommend buying small bottles of glue, not buying big bottles.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Like how small? Like the round one or like the oblong, like the little...
Like the ones that Type On gave away at Fine Woodworking?
Like a
where they're
half
1
ounce at a time.
half ounce?
I mean, think of all the plastic. No, like 4 ounces at a time or something. I know maybe that works well for me because I make small things, but
That'll last you like 3 years.
right, that'll last me a long time.
As long as you get the cap open.
Because I'm still using that bottle of hide glue that I was using before.
The one that you've declared is no longer good?
Yeah, I just keep using it. No, I threw that out long time ago. I gave it to Barry, our newest editor. He's been using it to make his dining table.
Yeah, that cow's calf is already an adult.
Yeah, that's mine. Buy a small bottle of
Ben
glue.
just got that.
No, I got it before, but I didn't.
Yeah.
All right. Let's
Surprised.
let's wrap it up. That's all for this episode of Shop Talk Live. Head over to the tauntonstore.com to save 20% on your order with the code GIFT20. That's GIFT20. And please spread the word about Shop Talk Live to your woodworking friends and neighbors. Shop Talk Live is dependent on your questions, so make sure to send them in to shoptalk@taunton.com. If you're watching on YouTube, please click that thumbs up button. And finally, you can keep up with Fine Woodworking on Instagram and on Facebook, and look for all of us on Instagram as well. Thanks for listening, and have fun in the shop, and be safe, and beware the yak saliva.
So I was speaking of saliva. I was just shooting an article with Tim Rousseau, and he is the shooting board, and when he puts down the fence for 45, he spits on the bottom of it, and then that helps it stay in place while he clamps it.